Hello everyone, this is Dipankar Pushari. I am a senior specialist solutions architect with AWS, and today I'm going to talk about role-based access control or RBAC in Amazon Redshift. I'm also going to show you how you can use role-based access control to manage database privileges in Amazon Redshift. For RBAC or role-based access control, the main idea is to assign privileges to roles and then assign roles to users. And now the user who has been authorized with this role will have all the privileges that this role has. And with RBAC, now enterprises can have more granular control of elevated user access instead of just super user versus regular user. Also, with RBAC, now different administrative users can be defined without full super user capability. Here we have role 1, which has been granted two privileges, and then role 1 is granted to user 1. This user can now perform tasks which are specified by the privileges A and B. So all the action of the users are now monitored by roles. And this user can now only perform actions specified by the two privileges but cannot do anything else. Now let's look at an example. In this example, we have sales underscore RW role, which has create table, drop table, and also update column 1 of table 1 privileges. This sales RW role is granted to Alice, and Alice will be able to create and drop tables and also update column 1 of table 1. But she cannot do anything else, such as create users. Next, let's talk about role nesting. Here we have two privileges, system privilege A, object privilege B, granted to role 1. We also have another role, role 2, which has been granted privilege C. In addition to that, role 1 is granted to role 2, and finally role 2 is granted to user 1. This user now has all the privileges which are inherited from role 2, which also includes inherited privileges from role 1. However, we should not introduce cycles in role authorization. For example, if we have a third role, role 3, which was granted role 2 and now tries to grant role 3 back to role 2 or role 1, Redshift prevents that from happening since it would have created circular dependency between these roles. Redshift issues an error message indicating that it cannot grant this role as a circular dependency was detected between these roles. RBAC in Redshift provides 4 system-defined roles with specific privileges. These roles cannot be altered or customized. They use sys: prefix, and this prefix cannot be used by user-defined roles. RBAC in Redshift also defines system privileges which are available out of the box and can be granted to role for assigning specific permission. Now let's move to AWS Redshift console and see Redshift RBAC in action.
Here we are in Redshift Query Editor v2, and we have a Redshift producer cluster, and we have accessed the producer cluster using a super user, which is AWS user. It has a database named Dev, and also it has a schema named Cells, which has 9 tables in it. And we are going to use set session authorization as we switch between different users. So we are going to show you that how we can create a role and then assign privileges to the role and then assign that role to the user, and then how that user is going to perform based on the privileges, perform certain activities, and also they will be denied to do certain activities because they don't have the necessary privilege. So let's get started. Let's start with setting the authorization to AWS user, and then using this command we can actually check who is the current user if it has been set properly. And then these are system views. Using these we can find out what role has been granted to which user, and then the second one shows what role has been granted to that role. or which has been eventually granted to the user. So in the first one, you can see this db admin has been granted db underscore admin, and db underscore admin role has been granted two system defined roles, which are sysdba and sysadmin. Now we can run the same queries using authorization for db admin, and it will give the same results. The difference would be when we have more roles, the super user has more visibility on each individual user and their roles, and if those roles has been granted any other role, versus non super user, they can only see their own user and obviously the roles that has been granted to the user and eventually to the role. So let's get started with creating the first role, which is a sales read-only role. This will be assigned to a sales analyst. So they only need select permission to perform certain analytical queries. And let's go ahead and create the sales RO role. And then let's create the sales analyst. And finally grant the usage on schema sales to role sales underscore RO. So notice here that we are assigning all the privileges to the roles, not to the user, and then the role finally will be granted to the user sales analyst. And as you saw, we just assigned select on all tables in schema sales to sales RO. So now let's switch the user to sales analyst, and let's make sure the switch has happened correctly, and then let's run some simple queries. So for example, if I want to run a select star on the region table, I should be able to run it using a sales analyst privilege. And notice the comment here, comments from Africa. Later we are going to try to update this comment. We can also run a simple query against the nation and select some 10 random rows. Let's also see the effect on these SVP user grants and SVP role grants. Those two are the system views, and see what it shows. So it shows sales analyst, which has been granted sales RO role, and then the sales RO role is not been granted any other role. So this particular table hasn't returned any roles. But if I set it to AWS user and then run the same queries, now I see I am able to see two different user with two different roles, and obviously earlier we saw db underscore admin has been granted to system defined roles. And again, db admin is not a super user, so you see here it still shows only db admin. So only the super user can see all those different users and their roles, and if they have been, those roles has been granted any other roles. So coming back and again setting the session authorization to sales analyst, now you see I can also select SVP relation privileges to see if whatever privilege has been granted to the tables, right? So I have 9 tables here in this cell schema under dev, and I see 9 rows written because all tables we have granted select permission to sales RO and eventually granted sales RO to sales analyst. But sales analyst doesn't have update privilege. So let's see what happens when I try to update. Obviously the permission is denied. Sales analyst only had usage on sales schema. So if I try to run any query on marketing schema on any of the relation or the tables that's residing in the marketing schema, it will fail. Similarly, the region tables are in the sales schema are not owned by sales analyst or neither the nation or neither any of the tables. So if I want to analyze or vacuum or truncate it, all of them will fail because they don't have, sales analysts don't have the necessary permission, and the sales analyst also doesn't own those tables. Now let's look at some of the column level access control that is still going to work in the same fashion with RBAC. So let's again elevate it to DB admin level and then revoke select from nation table. And then let's selectively grant only select to a nation key and nation name to sales RO, right? And then let's again change the authorization back to sales analyst and make sure that it is sales analyst indeed. Now let's try to now see nation has four columns, right? Nation key, name, region key, and comment, right? And I have given select permission on nation key and name, and I'm trying to select nation key and region key. So let's see what happens. Ideally, it should say permission denied, and that's exactly what is happening here. But I did give select permission to nation key and name, so ideally I should still be able to access it based on how column filtration or access control works, and that's exactly what it is. No, so now let's switch gears and create a read write role, which is, let's say, an ETL or a sales engineer who really needs permission to perform certain write activities such as insert or update or delete to the tables in the sales schema. So again, let's elevate the permission to dbadmin, and then let's create the sales RW role. The RW role has been created. Now here, one interesting fact is we are using role nesting, right? So we are just granting sales RO to sales RW. So basically all the privileges that came along with sales RO or has been granted to sales RO is now also inherited by sales RW. So now you see I have to create a user, and now with all those grants or privileges being granted to sales RW, let's now grant sales RW to sales engineer, right? And then let's keep this line for now. I'll show you why. Let's run some queries as sales engineer. So again, setting the session to sales engineer, and then let's run this simple query. Again, remember sales engineer inherited sales RW, but which in turn actually inherited sales RO. So remember, sales RO doesn't have select permission on region key. So if I run this query as a sales engineer, it would still fail. But it has select permission on nation key and nation name. So if I run this query like it happened earlier, it is properly returning rows. Again, I can run this system uh, views, and I can see that sales engineer, and then it shows this one is interesting, right? So now sales RW actually inherited sales RO, so it's coming up for sales engineer. And again, going all the way up, if I run this queries as AWS user, again you will see now sales engineer also got added, and here also after db underscore admin now we have sales underscore RW, because sales underscore RW actually inherited sales underscore RO. So again, coming back to the point where we left, let's now also look at this privilege. Okay, actually we need to change the session authorization again. So now it's back to sales engineer, and let's run this session SVP relation privileges, and you see all actually it is showing 8 because all the privileges are there except on the nation, so it's just showing 8. Okay, so you will not see nation here because it has a different level of permission now with only 2 columns allowed permission. Okay, so now let's set the session authorization to sales engineer, and let's try to update this. But obviously it has only inherited all the permissions from sales RO, and it doesn't have update or insert permission. So let's go back, elevate to dbadmin again, and then let's grant insert update delete specifically to sales RW. And sales RW was already granted to sales engineer, so now the sales engineer should be able to update. And remember earlier I told you to focus on this comment from Africa. So now we are going to add the date, and we are doing a backdated update. So let's run this as a sales engineer and perform the update. And here you see it says affected rows 1. So now if I go back and try to run a query on region as sales engineer, let's make sure again that it's sales engineer. So I should see that the comment has been updated. So now you see comments from Africa and 223 2022 has been updated. Again, sales RW doesn't have usage permission on marketing schema, so it still fails, and it doesn't own the region table, so it fails because it doesn't have explicit permission given or privileges assigned to sales RW to perform either analyze or vacuum or truncate. So we will perform those activities as dbadmin, but before we do that, I just want to show you two functions which are called role is member of and user is member of. So let's elevate to the super user. You can run it as an individual user, but that only shows that specific user's details. So we wanted to show you for all the users. In this case, we are trying to basically say if sales RO has been granted sales RW or not. So that's how you should read it. Role is member of. So if I run it, it either returns true or false. So it is false because sales RO is not inheriting sales RW, but vice versa is true, which is sales RW is actually inheriting sales RO. So that's why it's true. This one is also going to be true because sysdba, as we saw earlier, has inherited db underscore admin, and has actually inherited sysdba. And then sales analyst has been assigned. So now we are doing user is member of. So this will also be true because sales analyst has been assigned sales RO. And interestingly, this will be true because this is by hops via sales RW. Sales RO has been granted to sales engineer. So that's why it is true. But again, sales analyst has not been granted sales RW. So this is false. And finally, I wanted to show you that there is a validation. So we haven't created any role called marketing RW. That's why it does validate and it fails because it gives this error message because there is no role or group which is called marketing RW. So now let's perform some database admin activities. So let's change it to DB admin. And now we have done some changes to the region table. So let's run the analyze and it runs successfully. Let's also do vacuum. And finally, let's truncate the region table. So once I truncate, if I try to query, the count star will be 0, and then let's make sure that I reinstate it back. And if I do a count star now, it will have 5 rows because 5 rows have been inserted. Now if I want to revoke these permissions that I just created or assigned, I just need to go in the reverse order. So I can run all of them together, and the last thing, as you see, I started with creating the sales RO, but the last thing I'm doing is actually dropping the sales RO, starting with revoking the insert, update, delete on all tables in schema sales from sales RW. That's the last permission or the privilege that I have assigned. So if I run all of them together, you see these are all running and they are revoking all the privileges, dropping all the roles that we have created for this demo. So now we have cleaned up everything, and if I go all the way up and again set the AWS user as a authorized session and looked at it and see that it is actually correct. So then when we run this, it's only showing dbadmin. So it's no longer have those roles. So that's about RBAC and how you can assign privileges to perform certain activities and then grant those privileges to roles and then those roles to users. Thanks again for watching the video.